Good afternoon, good day. It's lovely to be here. I'm very grateful for the invite. So by way of introduction, I'm Elena. I'm based at the University of Cape Town, so I know many in the room. I work with many in the room. And I suppose I probably should say that I'm a firm believer in the interaction of the family and the state, mainly because I'm Irish. And the history of the Irish state and understanding families in Ireland, I should say, is intricately connected between religion, state and family. And so my kind of tutoring, my training, my background, my undergrad, all of that was constantly questioning the role that the state played in regulating women's bodies, lives and families, needless to say. So that's where the kind of the background insight comes from. So over the last, 7 or 8 years, or longer in terms of my work on customary marriage and kinship, but over the last 7 or 8 years I've been working on care in South Africa, care regimes in South Africa, specifically in relation to intergenerational relationships of care. So I think this talk flows on really well from Shireen's talk in the way that the previous talk gave us different conceptual ways of thinking about care and the different ways in which we need to mobilize paid and unpaid care. The different ways in which we have come to understand it in both the Southern African or South African kind of context or the continental context, but also gave us glimpses of how it compares to the global north, whether it's by welfare resourcing or the social distribution of care, etc. Now, what I think I'm going to do today, in addition to that, and to build on from that, is to go slightly deeper into the dynamics of families. How does care get negotiated? Who does what for whom and why, under what conditions? And what does that mean for the caregiver and the care receiver? In addition to that, I'm going to give, and these are in different contexts. We're going to look back in history to think about colonial histories and the very obvious ways in which they shaped care, but also the not so explicit ways in which they've shaped thinking around dependency and interdependency. In addition to that, it's thinking around care during pandemics, be it COVID or other pandemics, and questioning how we've got to the moment where we are in a post-independent, post-colonial state, in ways that care is becoming ever more increasingly privatized, and also in the way in which it's often decentered from other conversations happening. So I'm going to start by this image. An image that makes me wonder. An image that I don't entirely understand. So we all heard that care became visible during COVID-19, as if it was never visible before. I mean, the phrase care is invisibilized. I understand why it's used. I understand through the lack of recognition at a state level, at a remuneration level, but we all know who's doing care. It's highly visible in our lives, in our private lives, in our community lives, etc. So, I mean, if there wasn't an activity, I don't know if we have time for activities, but if I were to do an activity with the group here today, I'd actually ask people's interpretation of this image, because to me it doesn't make sense. It really doesn't. It came from an article based by a northern-based scholar, but in the kind of African section of the conversation. So I was trying to figure out, well, what's the message here? And needless to say, it was about that constant reminder from the north about how do we reconcile work and family life. But the words, Shireen reminded us how important words are, how important the conceptual work they do. What is childcare? What is childcare? When did that word come into our vocabularies? Whether it's, and particularly in English, needless to say, but is it, did it come from the market? Did it come from the state? How did it take place? I don't talk about when I'm minding my children or minding my nieces or nephews, I don't call it childcare. I'm doing childcare this weekend. No, we don't use those words. But these words have grown to have very kind of politicized, very obviously specific connotations, both positive and negative, and are used, they're mobilized. And we need to think about that. So I'm not going to ask you for your interpretation of this image, but I do want to ask you the question. If you were to imagine yourself drawing, and if we had time I would ask you to draw, if you were to imagine yourself to draw an image that depicted care responsibility, even if I want to say child care responsibilities, in your locality, in your context, wherever that was during COVID-19, what would that image look like? For whom and why? So if you're doing it about yourself, that's one image. If you're doing it about someone else you know, someone else you work with, what would be the types of depictions you would have depicted, basically? And would it look like this? So the second image I'm going to take you through is the work we've been doing for the last 4 or 5 years on mapping out what's called family maps, networks of kin. Now this is a fairly small network of kin. It's asking in, again, multi-generational households, which is the norm, asking who gives support to whom and why, and asking people to talk about that. So in this map, I'm going to move now, we have a 3-generational family. Again, 60% of children in South Africa live in multi-generational households. Roughly the same percentage of older persons live in multi-generational households. So this is by no way unusual, needless to say. Very much the norm. At the very top, you have the maternal grandparents who have deceased. Now, they only just deceased prior to me meeting with and working with Zoleka, the middle generation here in the dotted circle. So when I met her, she was still mourning her mother who had really just passed away a year prior. And she spoke about the caregiving she gave to her mother in those years prior to her death. But not only did she talk about that, she also talked about the work she does and care for her child, her own biological child, but also her niece and her nephew, right? Now, what happened was everyone in that bigger dotted line lives in the same house, physical house. Now this is a kinship network. So there's people who are part of the family but not living in the household, people who are not living in the house, who are living in the household, considered kin. So what happened was, following the death of the grandmother, Zoleka took on the care, the primary day-to-day care, financial care of the niece and nephew. Now she's a 50-year-old teacher. So she has a full-time job, she has a middle-income salary. Zandile, the one niece in the triangle, is living with disabilities, and she has full-time care needs. So Zoleka required, it's exactly what Shireen was talking about earlier on, Zoleka required the assistance of someone else to support her in her care responsibilities that she still carried when she was at work as a teacher. So, and you can see in this diagram, the care responsibilities are extensive. We can't talk about childcare in isolation to the care she gave to her mother at the same time, or the care that she gives to her auntie who came from a rural area to take on the day-to-day care while Zolek is at work. In turn, because the auntie has children in a rural area who she's supporting. They have, at that time, before the Social Relief Distress Grant was introduced, they had no source of income. They were young adults who themselves had children. So, in essence, Zoleka, if we think about responsibilities and caregiving, she's not only responsible for the people in the household, needless to say, but actually financially responsible for many others outside of the household who are part of her kin group. So, that's why I asked the question before, does that image make sense? Not really. Because if we were to understand family care, and we'll go into the question of work and what we mean by care, etc., and luckily that work's done for me. If we go into thinking, we know families are multi-generational. They can be 3-generational, they can be 4-generational. We know ever increasingly a large proportion of households that are in South Africa are what have been called female-headed household, what some call women-headed household, and what's now commonly referred to as slightly different female-dominated households. Excellent work done by many of our colleagues talking about how ever increasingly 50% of households in South Africa, the adults in such households are one sex or the other. So there's links to thinking of it like female headship, but slightly different. Because in such household, there are only female adults in that household. That's female-dominated households. But in essence, what the figures were showing us, in the early 2000s, is that about 40% of households were becoming female-headed. And we know the reasons. There's many reasons for that. What we also see in Zoleka's case is we see there are a certain number of people in households. She has 6 people in the household, but she has others who are not in that household. We know female-dominated households are larger in number, therefore have more responsibilities, and therefore have fewer resources, not just because they may be paid at a lower level, but because that money that they do have is redistributed to many more in the household and outside the household. This is common sense. Nothing that I'm saying here is probably new to anyone in this room. What also is happening, what I've just said, is that there's a range of care responsibility. We can't talk about care of older persons without talking about multiple care contexts. We've gone through multiple crises. There is overlapping, coexisting crises that leads to a greater level of care. And I'm talking crises and pandemics like unemployment. I'm not just talking about COVID-19 or HIV/AIDS pandemic. I'm talking about a range of crises that have led to what our colleagues here in the room have termed the crisis of social reproduction. I'll come into that now. But we can't make sense of any of this if we don't locate it in the unequal care context that was set up, or that exists now in the post-colonial state, that was set up through colonial mechanisms, colonial and apartheid mechanisms. And we need to understand them, the intricacies, year by year, decade by decade. It's not enough to just think migration, or the labour migration. What exactly were the policies that were shaping how we think about care, dependence and interdependence? So that's what I'm going to... some of the work, some of the work I've been doing over the last 7 or 8 years have been trying to make some of these contributions, conceptual contributions, like thinking about when South Africa moved from a colonial apartheid regime into a kind of an independent state. What decisions were made and why? Shireen had already mentioned everything happens in a moment. Everything happens in a specific context, a specific economic, political, social context. We need to understand what decisions were made then and why, but also what are the implications of that particular care structure, that particular care regime for families. The other thing which is remarkable is that for the last 2 decades there's been a quite extensive social protection system, particularly in South Africa. There has. It's applauded, and it should be for many reasons, many very good reasons. But what hasn't happened, there has been no investigation. How does that social protection system, if we even just think of cash grants come into a household, what do they do? Yes, we've got lovely quantitative studies that show us they reduce poverty. They alleviate some food hunger. What else do they do? What socially do they do? How do they play on relationships, hierarchies, systems of power? Who gets what and why, and what are the consequences of that? So that's something I'm going to talk about as well. The other thing that I think gets, I think overlooked is who's paying for care? I mean, Nancy Folberg asked that question. Dori Posel has shown in the last couple of years, or in the 2018 or 19, Hatch and Posel. It's one of the leading articles, I think, really to show empirically that particularly in Black South African families, women are financing care. They're not just doing care. The global discourse is about performing care, undertaking care, but who's paying for that care? And that work showed us very convincingly, although and wants to build, and this is obviously a body of work, that women, and particularly Black South African women, are financing care. And that's something to really take seriously, because that's some of the work we're moving into, is what happens when that goes, and it will go at times. So it's not just about very low income households that are heavily dependent on the state for support, but what about the low to middle incomes, or and that's a wide band. That's teachers, that's nurses, that's police officers, that's cashiers, that's people working in retail. The band is wide. What happens if they lose their job? Because as we saw in the first instance, they're supporting many. That whole system may collapse and becomes vulnerable as a result. And the last thing I'll talk about today is about the insecurity. Again, Shireen has pretty much said everything I'm going to say, but hopefully I'll highlight it with empirical work. Is the insecurity, the precarity that comes with female family caregiving. And that's not just for Zoleka. It's also for the cousin, the auntie who's come in here. By the way, I should say that auntie wasn't over 60. She wasn't in receipt of an older person's grant. She was unemployed prior to that. Hence, she could come and look after other, folks in the family. But the insecurity that breeds for her, again, Shireen's already pointed to, is what I'll talk about. So this is, I should say, all based on the last. Well, COVID has obviously confused us with years. Where are we anymore? So I think since 2020, I've lost count. But this was in 2017, 18, 19, bits in 2020. And so for the last 4 or 5 years, I've been doing a study on intergenerational relationships of care. And it had kind of 2 foci. The one was looking at certain households that are very dependent, highly dependent on social grants as really the only source of income, although there were other bits of smaller sources of income. And thinking about the flows of support in such households. The second was looking at low to middle income households, what I've just showed in Soleka's case as a teacher. And the study was taking place in Cape Town and Johannesburg. And it looked at family sets. And what I mean by that is we worked with families, at least 2 people in each family, thinking again from the perspective of both the caregivers and the receivers. And many people are both, because Soleka is receiving help. She's receiving help from many in that household in different ways. But she's also giving a lot too. So this idea like that there's only one caregiver, or we're obviously these things are coexisting. Yes, that's the overview today. Now, I'm going to take a break on thinking about today and the current context to go back in time. And how I'm going to do that is I'm going to use this quote from Justice Glolo in one of the leading cases, FESS versus the Road Accident Fund. You may wonder, why are we looking at road accident fund cases? What has that anything got to do with families? And I didn't know where I was going with this when I started there. But what I did find out is we've spoken, and Shireen's spoken today, about the way in which the strong families, the supportive family discourse, the African family discourse gets used and mobilized by political leaders, by a range of stakeholders. Because at times of austerity, but at times of fiscal crisis, they can pull back on what they have to do, right? Because we do have strong families. Women will step in, and they will step in. So when is it used? Positive, like to the benefit of us? So when is interdependence, when is Ubuntu used to the benefit of us in ways by the state? And when is it abused? And I'm going to give you an interesting, almost paradoxical example. So imagine you're a family and you have a 28-year-old, and this happens a lot, a 28-year-old who is employed, and that they're sending remittances to other family members, like we kind of see in Soleka's case, but unfortunately the 28-year-old passes away through a car accident. And this kind of sounds quite sensational, but it's not. These things do happen. That family and that wider family were dependent on the 28-year-old's income. He or she remitted every month, whether it was 1,000, whether it was 2,000, whether it was 500, a regular sum, right? This is the story. At the point at which he passes away or she passes away, that household no longer receives that income, needless to say, right? That family no longer. So what can we expect? Who will step in that situation? Okay. Regardless of fault. This is not about fault in a car crash or a road accident. It's nothing to do with fault. So, on the one hand, we have the Road Accident Fund, an arm of the state, pretty much a social security mechanism for all intents and purposes, right? They argue, oh no, we've got no responsibility to that family. And one of the family members, usually older women, take a claim against the Road Accident Fund. They say, I received X amount from my son every month. It was his customary duty to support his parents, me, let's say, as the older mother. Now he no longer does that. He set up the expectation to do that. You as the state, if you recognize customary law, which you do, you have the duty to compensate us for the income that he's no longer able to give us. Up until the point that I can receive some other state support, i.e. when I become 60 and I receive an older person's grant. There are 350 of the cases that I looked at. There's probably way more that I didn't look at. This is not what I'm trying to say here. What happens? The state security system denies the very practice of a family member supporting another family member. It says that may have happened, but you didn't have to do it. You're under no common law obligation to do it. But South Africa is a legal pluralist state. It recognises customary law. We recognise Ubuntu. Who comes in as the hero? The judiciary. The judiciary are fantastic in these cases, I should say. I sound like I'm in cahoots with the judiciary. They are. They are. And here is where Ubuntu and interdependence is positively used and actually embraced and recognised. Recognised by the judiciary, not the state. I know, it gets complicated. But this shows you the different arms of the state are not saying the same thing. They're not in agreement or alignment. We see this in customary marriage all the time. We see it across many different kind of examples. So So what does the judge state? He says, in African tradition, to bring up a child is to make for oneself an investment, in that when the child becomes a grown-up and is able to participate in the labour market, that child will never simply forget about where he came from. This duty is inborn. You can see the danger of that as well. In this case, it helped. The African child does not have to be told by anybody to honour that obligation. Now, other scholars, there's many, they've talked about Ubuntu do and Ubuntu talk. Well, this is a case where it's getting used, as I said, to the benefit. But we know, over the last 2 centuries, interdependence was socially engineered at every moment. Whether you're talking poll tax, whether you're talking hut tax, whether you're talking the Natal Marriage Act of, 1876? I think that could be wrong. Like in the 19th century. At every moment, there was some form of distortion, whether it was a law, a regulation, a code that said, Black South Africans, you're economically, not only am I going to economically marginalise you in very obvious ways with the Urban Areas Act, X, Y, and Z, I'm actually going to sanction you to pay an extra tax. I'm actually going to sanction you to do X, Y, and Z. Interdependence was created. Whilst it's a cultural ethos to be celebrated, it was paired with a social engineering of poverty, which we know, but that's also blends into our normative understanding of what we're expected to do. If we've been expected to do this for 2 centuries, and probably longer under different circumstances, how then today are we suddenly going to think of anything else other than that? And so, in first year in sociology at UCT, we teach this. We try to teach and think about what is the link between dependence and interdependence. We know there's a long history of the concept of dependence, how it's moralized, how it's been demystified and how it's been used in America, in the UK, everywhere across the globe. It's part of the kind of welfare talk and the discourse. We have it here, welfare queens or taxi queens. There's probably many other words that I may not know. But then we have to think, and I've done some of this work with regards to customary marriage. I haven't yet done it in relation to specific care practices. But in each decade for 2 centuries, there was some new other version of regulation or law that again created an economic sanction, that again created the need for someone to not be able to go to their family, or to be able to go to the family, but under certain conditions. All of that meant, we know the Mampela-Rampela's migrant hostel work. We all know that work, or many of us know that work. So these colonial policies not only shape practices of care then, I would argue that they have been seeping in to a psyche, to a being, a way of being, that has also led to normative attitudes of how we think about what we're supposed to do. There was a question earlier in the last session, based on an example in their own personal experience of what should we do in a certain situation. My mother-in-law asked me to do X, Y, and Z. Or should I look after my mother-in-law? We asked 121 people. We gave them a vignette where a mother-in-law, and I don't use that word, I don't like to use that word, but she becomes sick and she needs care. She gets Parkinson's. We ask people, and it's the husband's mother, what would you do if you're the wife? How would you manage care? And what almost every single person said, there was great hesitancy. Yes, there was recognition of, she's my mother. Doesn't matter if she's my own biological mother, she's our mother. And I will look after her. But do they have 2-bedroomed house or do they have a 3-bedroomed house? Is she working or is he working? How much money do they have? So every single person went to the materiality and the conditions under which, if she were to come into the house and we were to look after her, what would it mean for us and our lives? Can we afford a carer? And these are obvious questions. This is what we do. So in these responses, we see people are questioning that. Now I'm going to move on from thinking about very series of decades of colonial kind of policies that we possibly don't even need to mention, but to remind ourselves of the way in which interdependence has been shaped over time. To think about the post-independent moment, the kind of early 90s period, and I think there's many in the room that are probably better located to be giving these kinds of commentaries. So what was to happen in broad terms? not denying the complexity of what, the discussions, who was involved, and what have you. Was it a question of deracialization? We know there was a very generous care regime that existed for the white minority from the early 20th century, and it was denied. So there was heavy racial discrimination, who could access support from the state, all through the 20th century, up until, as we know, the independent period. But what were we to do? Were we to then carry that system and basically offer it to the majority of the population? So would we extend the privilege that had only been for white people to the vast majority? Would that tackle underlying inequalities? Or should we design a system that maybe is about individuals, so carers, older persons, as individuals, that they have needs, and those needs need to be met? What kind of framework should we use to thinking about how we model our post-independent welfare structure? There are developmental concerns. There was very strong concerns that welfare would make people weak and make people dependent on the state. There was also very strong discourses circulating about what the family should do, and that we shouldn't be reliant on the state for all things, particularly related to care. But what was the reality on the ground is that there was heavy fiscal constraint at the time, and what could be done was determined to some extent by the economic condition, amongst other things. So what did we get? We all know, at least in South Africa, the various forms of support that were then introduced and developed over the last 20 years. Multiple forms of cash grants, primarily, although some care provision, albeit limited. And as I said, we can really applaud the state for doing this tremendous work that really has made huge inroads into poverty reduction, food hunger, etc. But it doesn't come without tensions. And it's the tensions we need to pay attention to when we're thinking about care. And we think about, how do we mobilize care? What are the things we are fighting for? So if we investigate and think about and explore, how did cash grants, when they came into households, what did they do? Well, reality is they caused a huge amount of tension, gendered and generational tension. I'm going to come to that now. So on the one hand, they're reducing poverty, that's absolutely clear. But actually there has been so much economic change over the last 20 years that are they really enough? What is that value, that modest amount that we were all fighting about during COVID-19 and we were seeking more? I mean, that lobby group that we were probably all part of had a huge voice and impact on trying to get more resources. Not only that, but there were huge holes in the safety net. Up until the introduction of the Social Relief Distress Grant in South Africa, there was not a single social security for working-aged, able-bodied persons. So a huge gap of 18 to 59 existed. Who were 18 to 59-year-old folks going to be able to rely upon? Families. Not only that, but these grants focused on individuals. Now, individuals don't operate in families. Individuals relate to, live with, negotiate with others in their family. So you had, as I said, you had resources going into the hands of some, but those same people then had to figure out how are they going to manage this money with their mother, their sister, their brother, their uncle, their auntie, everyone they were living with, and others. You had really competing discourses at play between individuals who received grants, who had some economic independence. And I'm going to share some of the good work that others have done in this as well. There was also some care provision. Again, we can applaud, the great inroads that have been made in terms of educational outcomes and the free schooling for 6-year-olds, grade R as it's called, and the rollout of early child development centres, something Nonzuzu here in the room knows better than probably anybody who's been working on this over the last couple of years. But there's still problems. The vast majority of ECDs are unregistered, unsupported, financed largely by community-based organisations, international organisations, other organisations, not necessarily by the state. It's similarly with old age homes. There's 417 old age homes in South Africa with a population of 5 million people who are, where does that go? We know in some cases they're subsidized. They're not fully paid for. I think there's only a handful that are fully paid for by the state. They're subsidized by others. and the people who are living there themselves if they can afford to do so. They're also targeted at the very frail. Like, you have to, when I say the restrictions and the eligibility for being allowed to have a place in an old age home is highly restrictive. But there are huge amounts of community-based programs that exist that do the real work on the ground of supporting the care of older persons. The number at the moment is like 1,800 that the Department of Social Development supports. There are others that they don't support. But this is negligible to what the need is. So what happened when social grants came into the household? So we have a special issue looking at this. Social protection, intergenerational relationships and conflict. But what happened is most grants are paid to women. Now I know this has changed since the Social Relief Distress Grant, right? And we don't know what's happening with that, where it will go. But what happened is grants were going into the hands of women. Mainly as caregivers, let's be honest, not as citizens, as individual citizens. 14 million grants are paid to women, less than 3 million to men. 4 times as many women receive grant compared to men. But a high proportion of the benefits were actually going to pensioners because of the value of that particular grant. So resources were put in the hands of women, but also older women specifically. Now, Grace Kuno has a fantastic paper on situations where you have very common female labour migration household. You know, the older person's looking after a child or children. The middle generation woman is in a city working. Who gets the SASA card? Who should have it physically? Who should manage it? Who should control it? And how does that, and particularly if there's a teenage child, what power do they have over it? There's a 3-way contestation happening in households over that particular money. And she talks about that. Now, our colleagues here have talked about the crisis of social reproduction. So those tensions we see them play out. It's talked about the high levels of poverty, unemployment, the household size. That women spend actually in South Africa 8 times more time on childcare. Now again, how do we classify childcare? In a time use survey, it's one thing, it's very crude. If I'm doing cognitive labour, of thinking about what my child has to do tomorrow, is that counted? No, it's not. If I'm preparing a particular meal because I know my older mother has diabetes, so I'm going out to a shop to buy specific items, is that counted? Not necessarily. So there's a whole range of labour, of work activities that we engage in, either emotional, cognitive, relational, in managing care in households that are never counted in these surveys. I'm going to give you another example. And this speaks to, yet again, not necessarily a low-income household, but a highly precarious household because of the nature of employment, but also because the level of care in the household. So again, we have, this time it's a 4-generation household. Lebo is I think at the time I was talking to her, she was about 25. Now in this household, we have a sharing of resources, both in terms of practical care and the financing of care. So Lorraine, who's the grandmother here, was made redundant about 8 years before I met with her in 2017, right? At the time she was 50. She didn't get another job. Not least because she thought her opportunities weren't necessarily great, but because she ended up having to mind the grandchild because Lebo works an hour and a half away from her place of employment and needs to leave early at 5:30 in the morning to be able to get there. Creche only opens at 7:30 or whatever time it was, and therefore there was these care gaps. And we know it's a juggling act. Not only that, but Lorraine was also at the same time caring for her mother, who had severe mental health challenges and required pretty much full-time care. Now the issue with this, and something else we do in our work, is we look at monthly budgets. And in this monthly budget, to cut to the chase, we can see, despite Lebo being what's classified as a middle income earner, at the time she was previously on 7,500 Rand per month, it got cut down onto a 4,500 Rand as she moved from one short-term contract to the next short-term contract with the same company, which happened regularly. They were barely breaking even. You can imagine any kind of shock. It doesn't even have to be a shock. It can just be another expense. Going back to school expense. Any kind of expense. Funeral expense would be an obvious one. That household is going to feel, everyone in that household is going to feel it. Now, our current work, which is a 5-year research program on thinking about family care of older persons in southern Africa that takes in looking at families in Botswana, Namibia, Malawi and South Africa, which is funded by the Wellcome Trust, is going to do similar work in thinking about who's doing what for whom and why. And the difference in these types of household is, if we think about who was providing huge amounts of care throughout the 90s and 2000s, who always provides huge amounts of care? Older persons. Now, what happens when they're no longer able to provide care physically? Who carries that responsibility? So this is the household. Zandila, she's a nurse, she's middle income. She has her own 2 children. Joyce, her mother, 71, has diabetes. She had a stroke recently. She is fully dependent now, requires full-time care. Zandila moved back into the house to be able to look after not just her mother, but actually the 4 adult children and children who the grandmother was once looking after and no longer can do. So when we think about care responsibility, there's a reproduction here. There's a reproduction of care responsibility. That's the invisible work and practice that's happening these days. We can manage ways of thinking about who do we pay and why. Here there is, across generations, another layer, another generation of women who will be doing heavy amounts of care work. Shireen talked about depletion, exhaustion, well-being, and Nonzuzo in her work before and others in their work. We've mapped out what the day looks like, starting at 5 and ending at 10. Multiple forms of care throughout the day for multiple people in that family. So when we think about care, there's obviously that complexity to it. There's the insecurity that comes with it. There's multiple family responsibilities. It's not good enough. And I think it's one of the downsides of the existing literature, what we know, it's always focused on children or older persons. They need to be married. Because what's happening in families is it's not just one or the other. It's all of this happening at the same time for the most part. And so we need to think that not only that, but that care burden is not experienced equally amongst all employed women. We know the racialized class dynamics of this. We see in our evidence and in other literature that more dependents live in female-dominated black households who have fewer resources. But we also need to think about the differently placed women in that family. So similarly in this case, a cousin was asked to come and take on much of the day-to-day responsibilities when Zandila was at work as a nurse. It on its own is exhausting work activity, never mind to come home to have additional care activities. So if you think about this whole family is in a precarious condition, if anything happens to her job or anything happens to her, like I'm not using a road accident fund, that's a bit dramatic, but any kind of shock. But so is the cousin, because she does get paid. She gets paid between 500 and 1,000 a month, which is unfortunately below the minimum wage. But we're not to scorn Zandila for not paying the minimum wage. That's not where the blame lies. We're not here to blame or look and try to moralize inside of families. We're here to think about how can we think about care? How can we support this work? What is the best ways in doing so? And with the way in which the state and state support of care is going, which COVID-19 allowed us to see, I think, we've got a very worrying picture on our hands. So we think of COVID-19, this care and the state. Nonzuzo and I worked on mapping out what happened to the early child development sector, but not from the sector's perspective per se alone. What happened to women who were either caregivers, paid or unpaid, to the children, needless to say themselves, what happened to them, where did they go? And South Africa has a unique story, but also not just the ECD systems. What were the other state mechanisms of support that were being used or not in the South African example? And who was there to push government, a bit like the RAF where the judiciary were pushing the state? Who was there to push the state to do more? We probably know the answer to that one. But interestingly enough, the South African Minister of Basic Education, as late as 38 April 2020, 5 weeks into the heavy lockdown, where you could pick up any newspaper anywhere, and all we were talking about were, well, there's many things we were talking about, but care, schools, lockdown, moving, locking down, safety, yak, yak, yak. The minister got asked, what's going to happen with ECDs? Oh, we've not given it full consideration yet. And that on its own could be repeated 6 months later, 6 months later, 6 months later. It kind of, through various successive waves of inaction, and only for various lobby groups and very, very well-organized lobby groups, that we saw the state having to create a kind of relief package not just for the paid caregivers at ECDs, who were literally on the brink of collapse, as many other scholars had pointed out, but also for people who relied on the ECD so that they could go to work or could do whatever they had to do. So it was for caregivers, as in parents or others, also paid caregivers, and also children. Now, on the 30th of July 2020, Minister Zulu announced that 1.3 billion out of the President's economic stimulus package will be allocated to the employment of 36,000 youth compliance monitors for early child development programs. This is when people working in ECDs weren't getting paid. Subsidies stopped. Food program stopped. And certain policies, or at least suggestions, needless to say, a range of civil society organisations prevented that from happening. But what we see in these examples, and Dewey in her own work, for example, is using how we think about the early child development sector, together with the social relief distress grants and the early eligibility criteria that it had in the early days, where women as caregivers who were in receipt of a child support grant weren't eligible for a social relief distress grant. If we marry those two, and we see, what did women actually do? How did they manage care for their children? We heard in the newspaper about all these informal, garages that were setting up unruly practices of minding children who were not supposed to be gathering. But they were essential workers. They were going to work in a whole range of activities. So what were they supposed to do? So what we saw in this moment was not just inaction by the state. There was a retreat from the state in terms of its support to care and families in this broader area. We see in such instances, and this is just as a glimpse of what may be to come, we see care being increasingly privatised at a moment when everybody was talking about it, which is kind of ironic. I don't know what they were listening to, but either way, we see in that moment and ongoing a deepening of care crisis, because I don't think the crisis of social reproduction lies only in low-income households. I really don't. I think it's much greater than that. And I think with any given shock, COVID is a good example, we will see how fragile households are and families are actually. And then we got to think about the broader issues. So be it at a household level, but a community level, and then moving away from that. What is the impact? If things like child support grants have been making great inroads into food, alleviating poverty, what are these care practices doing to thinking around transformation, racial, class, gender, and generational inequalities that are being reproduced currently because of the lack of support, the lack of attention, recognition, support for care, family care and specifically. And what will happen? So in the work we're doing at the moment, and we're looking at older persons specifically, I'm not sure if you're aware, but currently older persons in South Africa are about 8% of the population. In 25 years, they're going to be 20% of the population. That's the estimate. 20% of the population. So family caregivers currently are holding that space, right? The social protection system will collapse. The health system will collapse. It won't work for 20% of the population. So government, state needs to act now to think about how can we actually support family caregiving so that it is sustainable. It's not sustainable at the moment. And it's going to be less sustainable when 20% of the population are now, not necessarily 20% of the population will be requiring care, but there'll be a greater level of care need. not least because of the increase in non-communicable diseases and the increase in longevity of how long we're living, but for all of these reasons. So I suspect moving on from thinking of just the crisis of social reproduction is broadening it out to a whole range of family situations, of households, a much larger percentage that are at the brink and very, very fragile in terms of how we manage care and who does it. Thank you.